On the snow-swept Northern Pacific Railway in the winter of 1892, a man could handle playing cards with hands that once made outlaws beg for mercy. James "Ghost Eyes" Sullivan had traded his legendary Marshal's badge for a gentleman's attire, finding solace in the life of a traveling card player. But when the notorious Blood Rail gang stormed through his train car, they saw nothing but a well-dressed gambler past his prime. That mistake would teach them why Sullivan's legend never truly died. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the frost-etched windows of the Northern Pacific's eastbound express, dancing across the polished brass fixtures that James Sullivan methodically studied between casual hands of poker. His weathered fingers moved with deliberate precision, each motion as measured as the lightning-fast draws he'd perfected during his 15 years as one of the most feared marshals in the Dakota Territory. At 48, silver had begun threading through. His dark hair and crow's feet marked the corners of his pale blue eyes, eyes that had earned him his infamous nickname. But beneath his refined demeanor lay the instincts of a man who'd brought dozens of the worst outlaws to justice, dead or alive. The private first-class car rocked gently as it crossed the Montana wilderness, steam from the locomotive creating ghostly shapes in the bitter winter air. The daily ritual of shuffling cards and making pleasant conversation with fellow passengers had brought Sullivan the peace he'd sought when he'd turned in his badge 3 years ago. The wealthy travelers who shared his car knew him only as James, the card player, a mild-mannered gentleman who could tell entertaining stories and play a fair hand of poker. None of them knew that the slight stiffness in his right shoulder came from an old bullet wound earned in a shootout that had left 9 members of the Mason gang dead outside Bismarck. Sullivan paused his shuffling to adjust his silk cravat, a far cry from the leather duster and gun belt that had once been his daily attire. The only reminder of his former life rode in a specially modified holster beneath his tailored jacket, a custom Colt Frontier 6-shooter with pearl grips, its nickel finish dulled to prevent glare. He hadn't needed to draw it in anger for years, but he still maintained it meticulously, a habit born from experience. The first-class car had welcomed him without questions when he'd first started riding the rails 3 years ago, looking to build a new life away from violence. The railroad companies appreciated having a well-mannered gentleman who could keep card games civil and entertaining for their wealthy passengers. Sullivan had paid his way honestly, using both his poker skills and the small fortune he'd accumulated from reward money during his years wearing a badge. He'd built a reputation as a refined traveling companion who could be counted on for stimulating conversation and fair play at cards. As he dealt another hand to his current companions, a cattle baron from Oregon, a lumber merchant's wife, and a young mining engineer, Sullivan kept one eye on the passing landscape through the window. It was a habit that had saved his life countless times, and one he couldn't shake even now. The train was running late, delayed by heavy snow in the mountain passes, and that set his nerves on edge. In his experience, disruptions to routine often spelled trouble. The railroad detective, Michael Chapman, had passed through his car earlier, sharing disturbing news over a quiet game of solitaire. "Blood Rail gang hit another train," Chapman had said, his voice low. "Great Falls line this time. 4 dead, including a conductor. Word is they're moving east along the northern routes." The detective's fingers had drummed against his cards. "They say William Bloody Bill Reagan's leading them now. Mean bastard used to ride with the James gang before striking out on his own." Sullivan had nodded, keeping his expression neutral, even as memories of gun smoke and blood threatened to surface. He'd crossed paths with Reagan once, years ago in Wyoming Territory. The man had been younger then, but already showing signs of the killer he'd become. They'd never drawn on each other, but Sullivan had seen him gun down a Treasury agent in cold blood during a failed train robbery. The sound of the locomotive's whistle pulled him back to the present, Sullivan glanced up as the train began to slow, the wheels screeching against the frozen rails. The engineer was signaling an unscheduled stop, something that immediately set Sullivan's instincts screaming. What caught his attention wasn't just the unexpected halt, but the location, a narrow pass between towering cliffs, the perfect spot for an ambush. Setting down his cards with a murmured apology to his fellow players, Sullivan moved to the window where he could better observe the situation. The late afternoon sun cast deep shadows in the pass, perfect cover for anyone waiting to ambush a train. His hand unconsciously moved to his side, feeling the reassuring weight of his hidden colt where his marshal's badge used to rest. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Catherine Wells, the lumber merchant's wife, who had proven to be more observant than most during their card games. "Everything all right, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, her green eyes sharp. At 35, Catherine had shown herself to be both intelligent and perceptive, one of the few passengers who seemed to sense there was more to the quiet card player than met the eye. "Just fine, Mrs. Wells," he replied, forcing his hand back to his side. "Looks like we're having some trouble on the line." Before Catherine could respond, the train car door slid open, admitting Michael Chapman, the railroad detective's face flushed from the cold as he approached their table. "Mr. Sullivan, we've got problems," Chapman said quietly, trying not to alarm the other passengers. "Engineer spotted debris on the tracks ahead. Could be natural, but—" He lowered his voice further. "There's been smoke signals from both sides of the pass. Indian Territory, but these aren't any tribal patterns I recognize." Sullivan felt a familiar coldness settle in his gut. It was the same feeling he'd had before every serious confrontation in his past. "The Blood Rail Gang?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Chapman nodded grimly. "Reagan's smart. He knows these passes better than any lawman. They're probably waiting for us to clear the tracks, give them time to get into position." Sullivan's mind was already racing, calculating angles and possibilities like he used to do before a fight. The train was trapped in the pass, cliffs on both sides, with only the tracks leading in or out. The railroad company's security was decent, but had only 3 armed men, including Chapman. The nearest cavalry post was at least a day's ride away. "Best. Warn the passengers," Sullivan said, his voice deliberately calm. "Might want to send someone back along the line to the last station too, though help would arrive too late if Reagan's gang decides to move quickly." As Chapman hurried to alert the other security men, Sullivan caught Catherine studying him intently. There was a question in her eyes that she didn't voice. He'd seen that look before, people sensing the predator beneath his carefully maintained facade. He'd gotten good at deflecting such scrutiny over the years, but now he wondered if maintaining his cover was worth the risk to everyone aboard. The rest of the passengers had begun to murmur nervously, word of the delay spreading quickly through the car. Sullivan served himself a small measure of brandy and listened, gathering scraps of information. Some said they'd seen riders in the distance, others swore they'd heard gunshots. All agreed on one thing: the Blood Rail Gang was the most ruthless group of train robbers in the territory. Chapman returned as the sun dipped lower behind the cliffs, gathering the first-class passengers for a quiet briefing. Sullivan sipped his brandy, listening as they debated options. The cattle baron wanted to try buying off the gang, while the mining engineer insisted they should arm the male passengers and fight. Throughout the discussion, Sullivan felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. He'd spent 3 years building a new life, becoming someone else. The colt under his jacket called to him now, reminding him of the man he used to be, the man they called Ghost Eyes, who'd never lost a gunfight and whose name was still whispered around campfires across the territory. As the impromptu meeting broke up, Chapman lingered near Sullivan's table, the man's face etched with worry as he nursed a cup of coffee. "You've been quiet, James. What's your thought on all this?" Sullivan wiped his brandy glass slowly, choosing his words with care. "Men like Reagan, they smell fear. Once they decide to hit a target, trying to buy them off only makes them bolder. Chapman studied him for a long moment. You sound like you know something about such men. I've seen my share of trouble over the years, Sullivan replied carefully. Enough to know that sometimes standing your ground is the only choice you've got. The detective nodded slowly, then finished his coffee and stood. As he reached the door, he paused. Funny thing, James. Way you carry yourself sometimes reminds me of stories I used to hear about a marshal called Ghost Eyes Sullivan. Real. Legend, they say. Disappeared about 3 years back. Sullivan kept his expression neutral as he continued wiping the glass. Lots of stories in these parts, Mr. Chapman. Most of them are just tales grown tall with telling. Through the windows, Sullivan watched Chapman cross to the next car, likely to continue preparations for whatever was coming. The winter sun was setting fast, painting the snowy cliffs in shades of crimson that reminded him too much of other sunsets, other fights he'd hoped to leave behind. Catherine Wells approached as he set down his glass, moving with the deliberate grace of someone used to navigating both train cars and social situations. Mr. Sullivan, she said quietly, I heard the detective talking about trying to negotiate. Maybe... She hesitated, fingers worrying at the cameo brooch at her throat. Maybe you should consider moving to one of the rear cars until this is resolved. Sullivan looked at the woman who'd become something of a friend over their many shared card games, seeing genuine concern in her eyes. Your husband entrusted your safety to this train, Mrs. Wells. I aim to see you reach him safely. He managed, a reassuring smile. Don't you worry about old James. I've weathered worse storms than this. But as the shadows lengthened across the snow-covered pass, Sullivan couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful life as a traveling card player was about to come to an abrupt end. The only question was whether he could protect his fellow passengers, without revealing the man he used to be, and still was, beneath the gentleman's attire and careful manners. As twilight settled over the stranded train, Sullivan began his evening routine, though his mind wandered to the hidden colt beneath. His jacket, every creak of the train's settling frame, every shadow that moved beyond the frosted windows, drew his attention. The first-class car had grown unusually quiet, the passengers seeking comfort in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. The piano in the corner stood silent, its usual evening melodies replaced by the mournful wind whistling through the mountain pass. A commotion near the forward door drew Sullivan's attention. 3 men he didn't recognize entered the car, snow still clinging to their heavy coats. Their spurs rang against the wooden floor as they made their way through the car, and Sullivan noted how their eyes scanned the space, not with the casual curiosity of fellow travelers, but with the calculating gaze of men sizing up territory. Scout. Riders, he thought to himself, watching their reflections in the window glass. Their gun belts were worn in the distinctive low style of professional outlaws, their revolvers carried tight against their thighs for quick drawing. Most telling was how they positioned themselves, one near each end of the car, the third staying mobile, all maintaining clear lines of sight to the doors. Quite a storm brewing out there, the tallest of the 3 remarked loudly, brushing snow from his coat. Shame if anyone had to venture out in it. His voice carried an edge of menace that sent several passengers shrinking deeper into their seats. Sullivan continued his card game with Catherine and 2 nervous-looking businessmen, his movements unhurried as he dealt another hand. Through the window's reflection, he tracked the 3 men's movements, noting their positions, marking their weapons. Old instincts died hard. As the evening wore on, more unfamiliar faces appeared in the car. Sullivan counted at least 5 more, men who carried themselves like Reagan's gang, scattering themselves throughout the space. Some pretended to read newspapers, others just sat nursing drinks and watching. They were mapping the layout, noting exits, identifying potential threats. Sullivan had used the same tactics himself in another life. Catherine moved with practiced composure, but Sullivan could see the tension in her shoulders. She'd grown up in railroad towns, learned to read danger in the air. She knew something was wrong. When she passed his table to retrieve her fallen glove, she leaned close. "Those men," she whispered, "they're not just passengers, are they?" Sullivan shook his head slightly. "Best move toward the back of the car, Mrs. Wells. Stay close to the other ladies." "I won't leave you alone with them," she insisted, her chin lifting with stubborn determination that reminded him of his late wife Sarah, another strong woman who'd never backed down from danger. Before Sullivan could argue, the car doors at both ends burst open simultaneously. The newcomer through the forward door was a giant of a man, his buffalo coat dusted with snow, a red bandana tied around his neck. Through the rear door came a leaner figure, moving with a predator's grace. The car fell silent as the two men approached, their boots heavy against the wooden floor. The crude snake tattoo on the giant's neck left no doubt about his identity. This was Snake Eyes Martinez, Reagan's right-hand man. Sullivan felt time slow down, just as it used to before a gunfight. Every detail sharpened. The way Martinez's coat hung open despite the cold, showing his gun belt, the calculating look in his dead eyes, the subtle shifts of his men around the car. One wrong move now could start a bloodbath. "Evening," Sullivan said, his voice mild as mountain stream. "Care to join our game? Always room for a few more players." Martinez's lips curled into a predatory smile. "Ain't here for cards, friend." He glanced around the car, taking in the well-dressed passengers. "Leastways, not yet. Just making sure everyone stays calm and comfortable while we handle some business up front." The lean man who'd entered from the rear spoke up, his voice carrying a soft Texas drawl. "Train's going to be delayed a bit longer, folks. Track damage is worse than expected. Best settle in for a long night." Sullivan could feel Catherine trembling slightly beside him, though she held her ground. The piano had fallen silent, and the usual evening chatter had died to frightened whispers. Martinez leaned forward, resting both hands on Sullivan's table, his right hand missing 2 fingers, likely lost to frostbite or a bullet. "You know what's coming, don't you, friend?" Martinez's words hung heavy in the air. Sullivan could feel every eye in the car on them. Passengers holding their breath, outlaws tightening their grips on hidden weapons. Smart thing would be to stay quiet, keep dealing them cards. This doesn't have to get messy. Sullivan studied his cards with deliberate calm, though his mind was racing through possibilities. "Seems to me," he said quietly, "if this was just about the cargo up front, you wouldn't need so many men in the passenger cars." He laid down a queen of hearts. "Makes a man wonder what you're really after." Martinez's eyes narrowed at Sullivan's composure. Most passengers would be shaking by now, but the card player's steady hands and level gaze seemed to unsettle him, slightly. For just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, the first instinct of a predator realizing it might be facing something more dangerous than it initially assumed. The moment passed, and Martinez's smile returned, colder. "Then the Montana winter outside. Smart one, ain't you?" He straightened up, his massive frame blocking the aisle. "See, we got word that there's something special on this train. Something Judge Morrison's sending east. Papers, you might say. Valuable papers." Sullivan kept his expression neutral, but his mind sharpened with understanding. 3 weeks ago, he'd heard rumors about documents that could expose corruption in the territorial government. Evidence of bribes, land deals, even murder contracts disguised as legal writs. Now he knew why Reagan's gang would risk hitting such a well-guarded train. "Papers," Sullivan mused, dealing another round. "Seems like an awful lot of trouble for some documents." The Texan moved closer, his spurs ringing softly. "Trouble's what we do best, friend. And anyone who makes extra trouble." He let the threat hang in the air. Catherine's hand found Sullivan's. Whether seeking comfort or offering support, he wasn't sure. But her touch reminded him of everything at stake, not just his own safety, but the lives of every passenger in the car. Women, children, elderly couples who'd done nothing to deserve being caught in this crossfire. Martinez signaled to his men, who began moving through the car, roughly searching passengers and their belongings. 20 minutes, he announced. Your conductor's got 20 minutes to tell us which strongbox holds those papers. After that, he drew a finger across his throat with his maimed hand. As the outlaws started their search, Sullivan counted weapons and positions, 14 men that he could see, all experienced gun hands. Through the windows, he caught glimpses of more shadows, moving in the growing darkness outside. Reagan himself was probably up front, supervising the search of the express car. A woman's scream cut through the tense atmosphere. One of Martinez's men had grabbed a young mother's bag, spilling her belongings across the floor. Her small son began crying, and Sullivan felt his trigger finger twitch. "That's not necessary," he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made several heads turn. "These people aren't a threat to you." Martinez spun back to face him, eyes glittering dangerously. "You got something to say about how we conduct our business, card player?" Sullivan met his gaze steadily. "Just suggesting that frightening women and children isn't the mark of professional men." A dangerous silence fell over the car. Martinez moved back to Sullivan's table, looming over him. "You know what I'm thinking?" he said softly. "I'm thinking you ain't just some fancy card player. Where you sit, where you watch everything." His hand dropped to his gun. "Why don't you stand up nice and slow?" Sullivan remained seated, his hands flat on the table. "I'm comfortable here if it's all the same to you." "It ain't." Martinez nodded to two of his men, who moved to flank Sullivan's chair. "Stand up, take off that fine coat. Let's see what you're hiding under there." Catherine started to protest, but Sullivan silenced her with a slight shake of his head. The moment he'd been dreading had arrived. The choice between maintaining his cover and protecting innocent lives. "Mr. Sullivan," Catherine whispered, "please." "It's all right, Mrs. Wells," he said softly. "Sometimes a man has to show his true colors." Slowly, deliberately, he stood. The motion caused his jacket to shift, revealing the slightest glint of nickel plating beneath. Martinez's eyes caught the telltale flash. "Well, well," he breathed. "What have we here?" He reached for Sullivan's jacket, but froze at the sound of approaching boots from the forward car. William "Bloody Bill" Reagan himself stepped into the car, snow melting on his black duster. He was shorter than Martinez, but carried himself with the cold confidence of a killer who'd earned his reputation. His eyes swept the car, taking in the scene before settling on Sullivan. "Got ourselves a armed man here, Bill," Martinez reported, hiding a piece under that fancy coat. Reagan studied Sullivan with cold calculation. Now why would a gentleman card player be carrying iron on a passenger train? He moved closer, and Sullivan saw recognition slowly dawn in his eyes. Unless he ain't just a card player. Sullivan felt time crystallize around him. That familiar moment before violence erupts, when every detail becomes razor-sharp. He could see Reagan's hand hovering near his gun, could track Martinez's men adjusting their positions, could feel Catherine's fear radiating beside him. Most of all, he could sense the lives of every passenger hanging in the balance, waiting to see what would happen next. "Been a long time, Reagan," Sullivan said quietly. "Wyoming Territory, wasn't it? That day you shot the Treasury man in the back." Reagan's face hardened. "Ghost Eyes Sullivan," he breathed. "Well, ain't this interesting? The famous Marshal, hiding out as a card sharp." His laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Boys, change of plans. Seems we got ourselves a bonus. Man who brings down Ghost Eyes Sullivan? That's the kind of story that lives forever." Sullivan remained outwardly calm, though his mind raced through scenarios with the speed that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. Every passenger in the car was a potential hostage. Every window a possible escape route or deadly vulnerability. Most crucially, he knew Reagan. The man wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice innocent lives to achieve his goals. You should have stayed. Retired, Sullivan? Reagan continued, pacing like a wolf, sizing up its prey, playing cards, living soft. Now you've complicated things. He gestured around the car. All these fine folks, their blood's gonna be on your hands when this gets messy. Only blood spilled will be on your account, Reagan, Sullivan replied evenly. These people have nothing to do with whatever game you're playing. Reagan's eyes narrowed. Game? This ain't no game, Marshal. Those papers we're looking for, they're worth more than gold. Names, dates, proof of every crooked deal and dirty secret in the territory. Judge Morrison thought he was being clever, hiding them on a passenger train. His smile turned cruel. But someone talked, someone always talks. Catherine stood suddenly, her voice steady despite her fear. You're wrong. Mr. Sullivan, Marshal Sullivan, he's not responsible for your choices. None of us are. Martinez moved to grab her, but Sullivan's voice cracked like a whip. Touch her, and those missing fingers will be the least of your worries. The giant outlaw froze, not from the threat itself, but from the absolute certainty in Sullivan's tone. He'd heard stories about Ghost Eyes Sullivan's speed, about how he could put a bullet through a man's gun hand before they could clear leather. Reagan signaled Martinez back. Brave words from the lady. But tell me, Sullivan, how fast can you be with all these innocent lives at stake? Way I see it, you've got two choices. Walk out that door into the snow, leave these good people to our tender care, or... He drew his revolver with deliberate slowness. Watch them die one by one, while you wait for your chance to play hero. Sullivan felt the weight of every eye in the car. The passengers looked to him with a mixture of hope and terror. Finally, understanding that their fate rested in the hands of a legendary lawman they thought was just another traveler. There's a third choice, Sullivan said quietly. You let these people go. Take your men, your guns, and whatever quarrel you have with Judge Morrison somewhere else. No one needs to die today. Reagan laughed, the sound echoing off the frost-covered windows. Always trying to talk your way out, ain't you? That's what they never put in the dime novels, how Ghost Eyes Sullivan would try to save everyone, even the men he was hunting. His face hardened. But sometimes, Marshal, violence is the only answer. Martinez, show him we're serious. The giant outlaw grinned and grabbed the nearest passenger, an elderly man who'd been quietly praying in the corner. But before he could drag his victim from the seat, Sullivan's voice changed, dropping into the deadly calm tone that had made hardened killers freeze in their tracks. Last warning, he said softly. Release him. Something in Sullivan's voice, or perhaps in his, eyes now cold as winter steel, made Martinez hesitate. The giant outlaw had faced down posses and rival gangs without flinching, but something about the Marshal's quiet certainty sent a shiver down his spine. Reagan noticed his lieutenant's hesitation and scowled. Getting soft, Martinez? He's just one man, one tired old lawman trying to play hero one last time. But Sullivan saw the doubt spreading among Reagan's men. They'd signed on to rob a train, maybe rough up some passengers. Going up against a living legend, a man whose name was whispered around campfires with equal measures of fear and respect, hadn't been part of the plan. Catherine, showing the same courage that had first drawn Sullivan's respect during their card games, spoke up again. Your men aren't as certain as you are, Mr. Reagan. Perhaps they've heard the real stories. Not about how Marshal Sullivan tried to talk his way out, but about what happened when talking failed. Reagan's face twisted with rage. He swung his gun toward Catherine, but Sullivan's movement was like lightning. His hand swept his jacket aside, revealing the pearl-handled Colt. He hadn't drawn yet, but the motion itself was enough to make every outlaw in the car tense. That's your last mistake, Reagan, Sullivan said, his voice colder than the Montana wind, threatening an innocent woman just to prove you're still the meanest cur in the territory. You haven't changed since Wyoming. Still a coward, hiding behind other men's guns. The car had gone deathly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as two legends faced each other, the famous Marshal turned card player and the notorious outlaw who'd built his reputation on bloodshed. The only question was, who would make the first move, and how many innocent people would be caught in the crossfire. Reagan's trigger finger twitched, but he kept his gun trained on Catherine. "Always thought you were better than the rest of us, didn't you, Sullivan? With your talk of justice and mercy, but we both know the truth. You've put just as many men in the ground as I have." "Difference is," Sullivan replied, his eyes never leaving Reagan's face, "mine all had a choice. Same choice I'm giving you now." The tension in the car was unbearable. Passengers held their breath, trapped between two forces of nature about to collide. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain pass, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. "Tell me something, Marshal," Reagan said, almost conversationally. "Those men you killed, the ones you gave a choice to, how many of them had families, wives, children?" His smile was razor-sharp. "You ever think about them when you're dealing cards and playing gentleman?" Sullivan felt the familiar weight of guilt and responsibility, but his voice remained steady. "Every night. That's the difference between us, Reagan. I remember their faces. You just count notches on your gun." A movement caught Sullivan's eye, one of Reagan's men slowly shifting position, trying to get a better angle. Another was inching toward the rear door, perhaps planning to bring in reinforcements. Through the window's reflection, he spotted a third man positioning himself behind a pair of frightened elderly passengers. Catherine must have sensed something in Sullivan's posture because she suddenly dropped her handkerchief. The simple action drew Reagan's attention for a split second, and that's when Sullivan made his move. His hand moved with legendary speed, the Colt seeming to materialize in his grip. His first shot caught Reagan's gun, sending it spinning from his hand. The second bullet struck Martinez's weapon before the giant could level it, the impact numbing his remaining fingers. Two more shots rang out in rapid succession, disarming the men who had been trying to maneuver into position. Each bullet found its mark with surgical precision, hitting weapons, not flesh, but leaving no doubt about Sullivan's deadly accuracy. The car erupted into chaos. Passengers dove for cover as Reagan's remaining men scrambled to respond, but Sullivan was already moving. He vaulted over an overturned table, his next shots keeping the outlaws pinned down, while he positioned himself between them and the civilians. "Everyone move to the rear of the car," he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. "Stay low, stay together." Catherine took charge, helping to guide the terrified passengers to safety. Through the windows, Sullivan could see more of Reagan's men approaching from outside, drawn by the gunfire. Reagan himself had retrieved his weapon and taken cover behind an overturned chair. "Kill him!" he screamed, his composed demeanor shattered. "Kill them all!" But his men hesitated. They'd heard the stories about Ghost Eyes Sullivan, about his supernatural accuracy and speed. Now they were seeing the legend in action, and it was more terrifying than any campfire tale. Sullivan's voice carried over the chaos, steady as steel. "Drop your guns, boys. Reagan's not worth dying for. Judge Morrison's papers aren't worth dying for. Make the smart choice." Two of the outlaws immediately threw down their weapons. A third backed toward the door, then turned and ran. But Martinez, nursing his injured hand, pulled a hidden derringer with his left. Sullivan's next shot knocked the small gun from the giant's grip before he could aim it. "That's 2 guns I've taken from you, Martinez. Care to try for 3? The outlaw's face went pale, and he raised his hands in surrender. More guns clattered to the floor as Reagan's men realized they were facing not just a skilled gunman, but a living legend who seemed to see every move before they made it. Reagan, seeing his control slipping away, did the one thing Sullivan had been dreading. He grabbed the nearest passenger, an elderly woman, using her as a shield. "Holster that gun, Marshal," he snarled, pressing his revolver to the woman's temple. or I paint the walls with her brains," the elderly woman whimpered. But her eyes met Sullivan's with surprising clarity. He saw something there, not just fear, but trust. Trust in the legend of Ghost Eyes Sullivan, the Marshal who never failed to protect the innocent. Catherine's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Sullivan, James, you can't let him leave." Sullivan's mind raced through possibilities. Reagan was desperate now, which made him more dangerous than ever. The outlaw's gun hand was shaking slightly. Fear, or maybe the lingering effects of the cold. His stance was off balance, suggesting an old injury to his left leg. "Last chance, Reagan," Sullivan said quietly. "Let her go. Face me like a man instead of hiding behind a woman's skirts." Reagan's laugh was tinged with hysteria. "You'll have to kill me, Marshal. And we both know you're too soft for that, too worried about adding another face to those nighttime hauntings of yours." "Some ghosts are worth living with," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm that had made him legendary, the kind that come from doing what's right, protecting those who can't protect themselves. Reagan's eyes darted between Sullivan and the elderly hostage, calculating odds and angles. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the windows in fierce gusts. Somewhere in the distance they could hear shouts. The train's crew and remaining security men engaging other members of Reagan's gang. Through the frosted glass, Sullivan caught glimpses of movement. More of Reagan's men were gathering outside, but something about their movements suggested confusion rather than coordination. The gang leader's reckless actions had clearly disrupted whatever careful plan they'd had for finding Judge Morrison's. "Documents. You know what your problem is, Sullivan?" Reagan's voice carried a manic edge now. "You think there's still good in this world, still believe in justice and law." He pressed the gun harder against his hostage's temple, making her whimper. "But there ain't no justice, just men with guns, taking what they want." Sullivan kept his Colt trained steadily on Reagan, but his eyes scanned the car, noting positions, angles, possibilities. Catherine had managed to gather most of the passengers at the rear of the car, where Martinez and the other surrendered outlaws sat with their hands raised. But 4 of Reagan's loyal men remained, watching the standoff with nervous trigger fingers. "That's where you're wrong, Bill," Sullivan said, using Reagan's first name deliberately, trying to connect with whatever humanity might remain. "There's always been good in this world. Seen it myself, time and again. Seen it today, watching these passengers look out for each other instead of just themselves." A flicker of something, doubt, maybe even shame, crossed Reagan's face. But it was quickly replaced by that cold killer's mask. "Pretty words, Marshal, but words don't stop bullets." "No," Sullivan agreed, "but they give a man time to think, time to make the right choice." He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his angle. "Like I'm giving you now. One last chance to end this without more blood." Reagan's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You still don't get it, do you? This was never going to end clean. Those papers, they're worth more than money. They're worth power, the kind of power that makes a man untouchable." "No man's untouchable," Sullivan said quietly. "Learned that lesson a long time ago, watching better men than you die for worse." "And causes," the elderly hostage, showing remarkable courage, spoke up. "Young man," she addressed Reagan, her voice trembling but clear, "I've lived 72 years on this earth, seen good men and bad, and I'm telling you now, you don't want to die like this." Reagan's grip on her tightened, but Sullivan saw the minute tremor in his gun hand grow stronger. The outlaw was coming apart, pressure and fear eroding his control. "Shut up," Reagan shouted. "All of you just shut up. Sullivan, you've got 10 seconds to drop that gun or—" A sudden loud whistle blast from the locomotive cut through his words. The unexpected sound made Reagan flinch, his gun shifting slightly away from his hostage's head. It was all Sullivan needed. His first shot seemed impossible, threading the narrow gap between hostage and captor to strike Reagan's gun hand. The outlaw's weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as it went spinning away. His second shot caught one of Reagan's remaining men in the shoulder as he tried to draw, sending him stumbling back. The other outlaws opened fire, but Sullivan was already moving. He rolled across the floor, his next shots picking off weapons with surgical precision. The elderly woman broke free in the chaos, and Catherine darted forward to pull her to safety. Reagan, clutching his bleeding hand, tried to dive for his fallen gun. Sullivan's boot came down on it first. "It's over, Bill," he said softly. "Been over since Wyoming. You just didn't know it yet." But Reagan wasn't finished. With surprising speed, he pulled a hidden knife from his boot and slashed upward. Sullivan jumped back, but not quite fast enough. The blade opened a shallow cut along his ribs. The pain only seemed to sharpen Sullivan's legendary focus. His next movement was pure instinct, decades of experience flowing into one fluid motion. The Colt in his hand traced a perfect arc, its barrel striking Reagan's temple with calculated force. The outlaw dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the floor. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, finally lost their nerve. Guns clattered to the floor as they raised their hands in surrender. Through the windows, Sullivan could see the train's security men approaching, having apparently driven off the rest of Reagan's gang. Catherine approached carefully, her handkerchief already out to tend to Sullivan's wound. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Sullivan nodded, though his side burned where Reagan's knife had caught him. "Been better," he admitted, "but also been worse." The elderly woman who'd been held hostage walked up to them, straightening her hat with trembling hands. "Young man," she said to Sullivan, "I do believe you're going to have some explaining to do about who you really are." A ghost of a smile crossed Sullivan's weathered face. "Yes, ma'am, I expect I will. But first," he turned to the train's security men who were now entering the car. "We need to secure these prisoners and find those papers. Something tells me Judge Morrison will be very interested in making sure they reach their destination safely." The aftermath of the gunfight brought a flurry of activity to the stranded train. Railroad security men, led by Michael Chapman, worked quickly to secure Reagan and his captured men. The winter wind howled outside, driving snow against the windows in sheets, but inside the first-class car, a different kind of storm was brewing. Sullivan stood by the window, watching as Chapman's men led the prisoners through the snow toward the baggage car, which had been hastily converted into a makeshift jail. His side throbbed where Reagan's knife had caught him, but he'd had worse, far worse. "Those papers Reagan was after," Chapman said, returning from supervising the prisoners. "Transfer, we found them, hidden in a false compartment of a lady's steamer trunk. Clever bit of work. Judge Morrison must have had help from someone who knows trains." Sullivan nodded slowly, his mind already turning over implications. "Reagan said someone talked. Someone told him about the papers, about this specific train. Means we've got a leak," Chapman agreed grimly. "Someone high up enough to know about Morrison's evidence, but corrupt enough to sell that information to outlaws." The detectives' words were interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Wells, who carried fresh bandages and a determined expression. "Sit down, Mr. Sullivan. Or should I say Marshal Sullivan? That wound needs proper tending." Sullivan allowed himself to be guided to a seat, knowing better than to argue with a woman who reminded him so much of his late wife. As Catherine cleaned and bandaged his injury, other passengers began to gather around, their fear giving way to curiosity about the legendary lawman they'd been traveling with. "Is it true what they say?" a young boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder, "that you can shoot a man's gun right out of his hand at 50 paces? "Now, Tommy," his mother scolded, but Sullivan raised a hand. "It's all right, ma'am. Truth is, son, hitting a gun is harder than hitting the man holding it. That's why I spent years practicing, so I wouldn't have to kill unless there was absolutely no other choice." The elderly woman who'd been Reagan's hostage settled into a nearby seat, her dignity restored, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I've heard stories about Ghost Eyes Sullivan for years," she said. "They say you got that name because your eyes seem to see through a man, right to his soul." Sullivan felt the familiar weight of his reputation settling around him like an old coat. "Names and stories," he said quietly. "Most of them grew taller with telling. Truth is, I was just a man trying to bring some law to places that needed it." Catherine finished bandaging his side and sat back, studying him with those sharp green eyes. "But you gave it up, traded your badge for a deck of cards. Why?" A long moment of silence stretched through the car as Sullivan considered his answer. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, everyone waited to hear the truth behind the legend. "3 years ago," he finally said, "I was tracking a young outlaw near Bismarck. Kid named Tommy Hayes. Couldn't have been more than 17. He'd fallen in with a bad crowd, started robbing stagecoaches. I caught up to him in a small town called Rivers Bend." Sullivan's eyes grew distant with memory. "He drew on me, fast. And faster than a boy that age had any right to be. But I was faster." He paused, the weight of that day heavy in his voice. "As he lay there dying, he told me he'd only turned to crime because his mother was sick, needed money for a doctor. His last words were asking me to tell her he was sorry." The car was silent, except for the howling wind outside. Even Chapman had stopped his work to listen. "I delivered that message," Sullivan continued, "watched his mother collapse with grief, and I realized something. Every man I'd killed, every life I'd ended in the name of the law, they all had mothers somewhere. Sisters, wives, children. Each death rippled out, touching more lives than I could count." He touched his gun, hidden once more beneath his jacket. "That's when I decided to find another way. Turned in my badge, started riding the rails. Figured I could do more good keeping the peace at a card table than I could with a gun." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Until today." "Until today," Catherine echoed softly. "When we needed Ghost Eyes Sullivan more than we needed a card player." Chapman cleared his throat. "Those papers Reagan was after, they could bring down some of the most powerful men in the territory. Corrupt judges, bought politicians, men who think they're above the law. Maybe this was meant to be, Sullivan. Maybe you were meant to be on this train, protecting those documents." Sullivan stood carefully, mindful of his injury, and moved to the window. The storm was beginning to ease, the snow falling more gently. Now, in the distance, he could see lights, a rescue train approaching from the nearest station. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe it's just that a man can't run from who he is forever. Sooner or later, the world finds a way to remind you of what you're meant to be." Catherine joined him at the window. "And what are you meant to be, James Sullivan?" He turned to face the car full of people he'd protected. Men, women, and children, who were alive because Ghost Eyes Sullivan had been there when they needed him. "I'm meant to be what I've always been," he said finally. "A guardian, whether that's with a deck of cards or a Colt, whether it's at a card table or facing down outlaws. Some callings, you don't choose them. They choose you." The rescue train arrived as the storm finally broke, its powerful locomotive pushing through the remaining snowdrifts. Railroad crews worked quickly to clear the debris Reagan's gang had placed on the tracks, while fresh security men helped Chapman secure the prisoners for transport. Sullivan watched from the first-class car window as Reagan and Martinez were led through the snow in chains. The outlaw leader's earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a cold fury that Sullivan recognized all too well, the rage of a man who'd seen his carefully laid plans crumble to dust. "They'll try to break him out," Chapman said, joining Sullivan. "At the window. Gang like that, they won't let their leader rot in prison without at least one rescue attempt." Sullivan nodded. "That's why we need to split them up. Send Reagan and Martinez to different prisons, spread the rest across the territory, make it impossible for anyone to free them all at once." "Already arranged," Chapman replied with a grim smile. "But that's not what really worries me." He lowered his voice. "Those papers we found, they name names, Sullivan. Powerful men who've been pulling strings from the shadows. Men who won't take kindly to their secrets being exposed." Judge. "Morrison knew the risks," Sullivan said quietly. "That's why he chose this route, this train. He was counting on the weather and the remote location to keep those documents safe. And instead, it almost got everyone killed." Catherine's voice joined their conversation as she approached, carrying fresh coffee. "If you hadn't been here..." "Marshal," Sullivan accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Someone else would have stepped up. I've learned that about people. There's always someone willing to stand against darkness if you give them the chance." Through the windows, they could see crews coupling their stranded train to the rescue locomotive. Soon, they'd be moving, again carrying Judge Morrison's evidence and their dangerous prisoners toward justice. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, her eyes sharp with concern. "Those men Chapman mentioned, the ones named in the documents, they'll come after. After all of us who know about them." Sullivan sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his battle-weary body. "Now we do what needs to be done. Those papers reach their destination, the truth comes out, and if anyone tries to stop that from happening..." His hand brushed the pearl-handled Colt beneath his jacket. Ghost Eyes rides again. Chapman's voice held a mix of respect and worry. "Thought you were done with that life, Sullivan." "So did I." Sullivan's gaze drifted to the other passengers, who were gathering their belongings and helping each other prepare for the journey ahead. "But sometimes, life has other plans. Sometimes the only way to keep the peace is to stand ready to defend it." The elderly woman who'd been Reagan's hostage approached their small group, leaning on a silver-headed cane. "Young man," she said to Sullivan, her voice stronger now that the immediate danger had passed, "I've lived long enough to know that good men can't always choose when they're needed, but they can choose to be ready when that time comes." Sullivan studied her weathered face, seeing wisdom earned through years of watching the world's turnings. "Yes, ma'am," he replied softly. "That they can." A commotion near the forward car drew their attention. Two of Chapman's men were dragging one of Reagan's captured gang members through the snow. The man was struggling, shouting something that was lost in the wind. "Bring him here," Chapman ordered, moving to meet them at the car's entrance. The outlaw was young, barely more than a boy, with fear written clear across his face. "Says he has information," one of the guards reported. "About who told Reagan about the papers." Sullivan set down his coffee and approached, studying the young prisoner. "All right, son. Let's hear it." The boy's words tumbled out in a rush. "It was Judge Carlton. He's the one who told Reagan about the documents, about this train. Said if we got them, he'd make sure we never saw the inside of a prison cell." Chapman's face darkened. "Carlton? He's one of the most respected judges in the territory." "And one of the most corrupt," Sullivan added grimly. "His names appeared in more than one investigation I handled as a marshal. Could never prove anything. Man's too careful, too well-connected." The young outlaw nodded eagerly. "He's got hooks in everything, railroads, mines, even some of the Indian agencies. Morrison's evidence would expose it all." Sullivan exchanged looks with Chapman. Carlton's involvement changed everything. The judge's influence extended throughout the territory, from law enforcement to the highest levels of government. "We'll need protection," Chapman said quietly. "For the witnesses, the documents, everyone involved." Catherine stepped forward. "My husband's company has connections in the East. Safe houses, private security. We could help." Sullivan shook his head, slowly. "Appreciate the offer, Mrs. Wells, but this needs to be handled through proper channels. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion that the evidence has been tampered with, and Carlton's lawyers will tear it apart." "Then what do you suggest?" Chapman asked. Sullivan's eyes took on that distant look his victims had described, the eerie gaze that had earned him his nickname. "We do this right, by the book, every I dotted, every T crossed. And when Carlton makes his move, because he will, we're ready for him." "You sound mighty certain about that move," the elderly woman observed. Because I know men like Carlton," Sullivan replied. "Men who think their money and power put them above the law. They can't help themselves. They have to try to maintain control, even when the smart play would be to cut their losses and run." The rescue train's whistle cut through their conversation, signaling readiness to depart. As passengers began returning to their seats, Sullivan made one final check of the car's security. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside pristine and white, but he knew from experience that the most dangerous storms were often the ones you couldn't see coming. The train rolled eastward through the Montana night, its twin locomotives working in harmony to push through the freshly fallen snow. Sullivan sat at his usual place in the first-class car, but rather than dealing cards, he was studying a map Chapman had provided, marking potential trouble spots along their route to Fort Lincoln. 3 major stops between here and the fort, Chapman explained, pointing to the map. Each one a chance for Carlton's men to make a move. Catherine leaned over to examine the route. "Why not bypass the stops, run straight through to Fort Lincoln?" "Locomotives need water and coal," Sullivan replied without looking up. "Can't make the full run without resupplying." His finger traced a line along the paper. "This station here, Miller's Creek. That's where they'll try something," Chapman frowned. "Why there? Bismarck's a bigger station. More cover for an ambush." "Exactly why they won't choose it. Too many variables, too many witnesses." Sullivan tapped Miller's Creek again. Small station, minimal staff, surrounded by hills perfect for shooters, and it's the last stop before Fort Lincoln. They'll want to make their move before we get too close to Army territory. As if to emphasize his point, the train whistle sounded, signaling their approach to the first station. Sullivan moved to the window, watching as they pulled into a small frontier town, glowing with lamplight against the dark. He counted at least 3 armed men on the platform who didn't move like regular railroad security. "Carlton's already got men watching the line," he said quietly. "Probably telegraphed ahead as soon as he heard about Reagan's failure." Catherine's hand found the small derringer hidden in her skirts, a precaution Sullivan had insisted upon. "How many do you think he'll send?" "For Miller's Creek, at least 20, probably more." Sullivan's eyes never stopped scanning the platform as their train took on water. "Carlton can't afford to fail. Those documents don't just threaten him, they threaten his entire network of corruption. Men like that, they'll burn the whole and territory down before they'll face justice." The elderly woman who'd survived Reagan's hostage-taking, they'd learned her name was Margaret Thornton, spoke up from her seat nearby. "In my experience," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "corrupt men are like rotted trees. They may look strong on the outside, but one good storm can bring them crashing down." Sullivan allowed himself a small smile. "True enough, Mrs. Thornton, but sometimes that storm has to be helped along." Chapman returned from conferring with the train's crew. "We'll reach Miller's Creek just before dawn. Best time for an ambush. Sun in our eyes if we're looking east." "Then we change the rules of engagement," Sullivan said, his tactical mind already working through possibilities. "Chapman, how many men can you absolutely trust? Men who haven't had any contact with Carlton's influence?" The detective thought. "In for a moment. 8, maybe 10. All good men with steady hands." "Not enough," Sullivan mused. "Not against what Carlton will send." He turned to Catherine. "Mrs. Wells, you said your husband's company has connections. How quickly could they respond if needed?" Catherine straightened, her eyes brightening with purpose. "There's a telegram office at the next station. I could have a dozen armed guards waiting at Miller's Creek within hours." Sullivan nodded slowly. "Good, but make it look like a routine company security detail, nothing that would raise suspicions." He turned back to the map. "We'll need to be ready before we reach the station. Once the shooting starts—" "If the shooting starts," Mrs. Thornton corrected gently. "When," Sullivan said with certainty. And men like Carlton, they only know one way to solve problems. His hand unconsciously moved to his hidden Colt. Violence is their first and only language. The train whistle sounded again as they pulled away from the station. Through the windows, Sullivan saw one of the armed men on the platform step into the telegraph office. Within minutes, the wire would be humming with news of their passage. "There's something else to consider," Chapman said quietly. "Carlton's not just a judge, he's a symbol. A lot of powerful people have invested in his reputation, used it, to cover their own corruption. If he falls, he takes half the territory's power structure with him," Sullivan finished. "I know. That's why this has to be handled perfectly. One mistake, one legal misstep, and they'll use it to discredit everything." Catherine studied Sullivan's face in the lamplight. "You've dealt with men like this before, haven't you? Not just outlaws like Reagan, but the ones who hide behind respectability." Sullivan's eyes took on that distant look again, seeing ghosts of past battles. "Had a case once, back when I wore the badge full-time. Corrupt banker named Harrison. Had half. The county in his pocket, used his connections to steal land from honest farmers. Took 2 years to build the case against him, and even then—" He trailed off, lost in memory. "What happened?" Mrs. Thornton asked softly. "Harrison walked free. Had too many friends in high places, too many judges willing to look the other way." Sullivan's jaw tightened. 3 months later, I found him dead in his office. Someone he'd ruined had decided to take justice into their own hands. "Is that what you're afraid of here?" Catherine asked. "That if Carlton escapes justice, people will turn to violence?" "Justice has to work," Sullivan said firmly. "Has to be seen to work. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? The badges, the courts, the whole system, it all falls apart if people stop believing in it." The night deepened as the train pressed eastward, its rhythmic clatter a counterpoint to the howling winter wind. Sullivan had moved from his seat to stand near the forward door, one shoulder resting against the frame. As he watched the moonlit landscape roll past, every mile brought them closer to Miller's Creek and to the confrontation he knew was coming. Chapman approached, his voice low to avoid disturbing the few passengers who'd managed to find sleep. "Just got word from the engine crew. Track's clear ahead, but they spotted signal fires in the hills. Someone's watching our progress." "Carlton's. Scouts," Sullivan confirmed. "Probably been following us since the last station." His hand unconsciously touched the pearl-handled Colt beneath his jacket. "How long until Miller's Creek?" 3 hours, give or take. We'll hit it just before sunrise." "Just like you predicted." Catherine joined them, carrying fresh coffee. She'd refused to rest, insisting on helping keep watch. "My telegram got through at the last stop. 12 men will be waiting at Miller's Creek, just as requested. They'll look like regular company security guards checking cargo." Sullivan nodded, his appreciation, both for the coffee and the information. "Good. Carlton's people will be expecting something, but if we're careful, we can control how this plays out." Mrs. Thornton's voice drifted from her seat nearby. "You're expecting quite a fight, aren't you, Marshal?" "Not expecting, Ma'am. Planning for." Sullivan's eyes never stopped scanning the darkness beyond the windows. "Best fights are the ones you see coming, gives you time to stack the odds in your favor." The elderly woman made a soft sound of understanding, like a chess game, moving pieces into position before the final moves. "Exactly." Sullivan turned to Chapman. "How are our prisoners?" "Reagan's still unconscious. Martinez is awake, but quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me. The others are scared, especially after what that young one told us about Carlton." Sullivan absorbed this information, adding it to his mental map of the situation. "Martinez is waiting. He knows Carlton will make a move, probably has instructions for when it happens." "Should we separate him from the others?" Catherine asked. "No. Let him think we don't suspect. Might work in our favor when things start happening." Sullivan took another sip of coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. "Chapman, I need you to rearrange the guard positions. Put your most trusted men furthest from the prisoner car. The detective's eyes widened with understanding. You want Carlton's people to think they have an easy shot at freeing Reagan and the others. The more confident they are, the more likely they are to make mistakes. Sullivan's voice held the quiet certainty that had made him legendary. And we need them to make mistakes. Can't afford to let this turn into a prolonged gunfight, not with civilian passengers on board. Catherine touched the derringer, hidden in her skirts. Speaking of passengers, shouldn't we try to evacuate them at the next stop? Get them clear before we reach Miller's Creek? Sullivan shook his head. Can't. Any unusual movement will alert Carlton's watchers. Besides, he gestured to the sleeping forms around them. These people are our best protection right now. Carlton's men will have to be careful about shooting with innocent witnesses around. Takes away their ability to claim they were just serving legal warrants, using their own need for respectability against them, Mrs. Thornton observed. Clever. Necessary, Sullivan corrected. Men like Carlton, they live and die by appearances. Strip that away, force them to show their true nature in public, and half their power evaporates. The train whistle cut through their conversation, signaling the approach to another small station. Sullivan straightened, checking his weapon with, "And practiced ease. Chapman, move among the passengers. Wake them quietly. Tell them we're expecting trouble ahead. But keep it calm. No panic, no sudden movements when we stop." "And if Carlton has men waiting at this station?" Catherine asked. "He will, but they won't move yet. They'll want to wait until Miller's Creek, where they can control the situation better." Sullivan's eyes took on that distant, calculating look. Still, no reason to make it easy for them to count our guns or study our positions. As the train began to slow, Sullivan felt that familiar tension building, the coiled spring readiness that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. But this was different from his days as a marshal, different even from the recent fight with Reagan's gang. This time, he wasn't just protecting law and order in some abstract sense. He was defending something more immediate. These passengers who'd placed their trust in him, the hard evidence of corruption that could finally bring justice to the territory. And perhaps most importantly, the belief that the law could work if good people were willing to stand up for it. The station appeared through the swirling snow, a small cluster of buildings glowing with lamplight. Sullivan counted 4 men on the platform who didn't belong, their stances too rigid, too alert for simple travelers or railroad workers. "Carlton's. Men," he whispered to Chapman, "making sure we're still on schedule for their ambush. What do we do?" "Nothing. Let them look. Let them think they know exactly what they're facing." Sullivan's smile was cold as the Montana night. "Meanwhile, we'll make sure they find something very different waiting at Miller's Creek." The train hissed to a stop, steam billowing in the frigid air. As the crew began taking on water and coal, Sullivan watched Carlton's observers through the frost-etched windows, reading their movements, their positions, the way they tried to look casual while studying the train's defenses. Every detail would be telegraphed ahead, helping to set the stage for the coming confrontation. But what those watchers couldn't see, couldn't know, was that Ghost Eyes Sullivan had already looked past the obvious moves, already calculated the angles and possibilities that would turn their carefully planned ambush into something very different. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of Judge Morrison's evidence, but the future of justice in the territory itself. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to paint the eastern sky when Sullivan felt the train beginning to slow. Miller's Creek lay ahead, nestled in a valley between snow-covered hills that looked peaceful in the pre-dawn light. But Sullivan's experienced eyes picked out the signs others might miss. Fresh tracks in the snow where there shouldn't be any, shadows that moved against the wind, the peculiar silence that often preceded violence. "This is it," he said quietly to Chapman and Catherine, who had remained vigilant through the night. "Remember what we discussed. No matter what happens, the documents are the priority. They reach Fort Lincoln with or without us." Catherine's hand squeezed his arm briefly. "They'll reach it with us, Marshal. All of us." The train's brakes squealed as they approached the station. Through the windows, Sullivan could see Catherine's security men positioned exactly as planned, looking like nothing more than routine guards checking cargo. But he also spotted at least a dozen of Carlton's men scattered around the station, trying too hard to look casual. "More in the hills," Chapman muttered, squinting through the growing light. "Probably got rifles trained on us already." Sullivan nodded. "Let them watch. Everything depends on them thinking they know exactly what they're facing." He turned to address the passengers, who were all awake now, tense, but admirably calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, when the shooting starts, stay low and away from the windows. This car's got the thickest walls on the train. That's why we moved everyone here." Mrs. Thornton spoke up from her seat. "What about you, Marshal? Where will you be when this storm breaks?" "Where I need to be," Sullivan replied simply. Then, to Chapman, "How are our prisoners? Still secured? Martinez has been awful quiet, though, like he's waiting for something." "He is." Sullivan checked his Colt one final time. "When Carlton's men make their move, he'll try to cause chaos from inside. That's why I had you pull your trusted men back. Let him think it'll be easy." The train shuddered to a stop at the Millers Creek platform. For a moment, everything was still. The calm before the storm. Sullivan could feel every eye in the car on him, looking to the legend of Ghost Eyes Sullivan for protection, for hope, for proof that justice could still triumph over corruption. The station master emerged from his office, moving with the stiff gait of a man under duress. Sullivan caught a glimpse of armed men inside the building behind him. The trap was set, all the pieces in place. Now it was just a question of who would make the first move. A man in an expensive coat stepped onto the platform, flanked by two others, trying to hide rifles under their long dusters. Sullivan recognized him immediately. James Carlton, Jr., the judge's son and chief enforcer. "Right on schedule," Sullivan muttered. "Chapman, get ready. Catherine, remember what I said about the signal." James Carlton, Jr. approached the train, his stance radiating arrogant confidence. "This train is being held under territorial authority," he announced loudly. "We have warrants to search for escaped fugitives believed to be hiding aboard." Sullivan stepped out onto the rear platform of the first-class car, letting Carlton, Jr. see him clearly. "Those wouldn't be Judge Carlton's warrants, would they?" he called back. "Seems to me a judge shouldn't issue warrants regarding cases he's personally involved in." Carlton Jr.'s face darkened with recognition. "Sullivan, should have known you'd be mixed up in this." His hand drifted toward his gun. "Stand aside, Marshal. This is official business." "Nothing official about corruption, son. Nothing legal about trying to suppress evidence of your father's crimes." "Crimes," Carlton Jr. laughed, but there was an edge to it. "My father's brought law and order to this territory, while men like you chase glory with a gun. Now step aside, or we'll be forced to take action." Sullivan's voice carried across the platform, clear and steady. "Like your father took action against honest men who opposed him, like you took action against families who wouldn't sell their land for your railroad schemes." "Last warning, Sullivan. We have the authority here." "No," Sullivan said quietly, though his words seemed to fill the morning air. "What you have is guns and money and the arrogance to think that makes you above the law. But the law isn't just words on paper or badges pinned to corrupt men's chests. It's a promise that justice matters, that truth will prevail, that no man stands above the right of common people to live in peace." He saw uncertainty flicker across some of Carlton's men's faces. They'd come expecting to overwhelm. Simple train guards, not face down a legend speaking hard truths about the men they served. "A pretty speech," Carlton Jr. sneered. but words don't stop bullets. No, Sullivan agreed, his eyes taking on that ghostly quality that had earned him his nickname. But they give good men time to make the right choice. That's why I'm giving your men that choice now. Walk away. Think about who you're really serving, what you're really protecting. The morning silence stretched taut as a drawn wire. Sullivan could feel the weight of every eye, passengers, guards, Carlton's men, the shooters hidden in the hills. One wrong move would set off an explosion of violence that would paint the snow red. But he'd seen something in the faces of Carlton's hired guns, a hesitation, a doubt. The seeds of truth he'd planted were taking root, making them question their orders, their loyalties, their part in this corrupted system. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of Judge Morrison's evidence, but the future of justice in the territory itself. And as the sun finally crested the eastern hills, Ghost-Eyes Sullivan stood ready to make sure that future was decided by truth and law, not greed and violence. The tension at Miller's Creek Station stretched like a wire, drawn too tight, ready to snap. James Carlton Jr. faced Sullivan across the platform, his hand hovering near his gun while his men waited for the signal to attack. But Sullivan had seen the doubt in some of their faces, the uncertainty his words had planted. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the prisoner car, Martinez making his move, just as Sullivan had predicted. The sound of struggle and shouts provided the spark Carlton Jr. needed. "Take them!" he roared, drawing his pistol. But Sullivan was already moving, his legendary speed turning thought into action. His first shot caught Carlton Jr.'s gun, sending it spinning away. His next two bullets disarmed the men flanking the corrupt enforcer before they could level their rifles. The hillside erupted with gunfire, but Sullivan had anticipated this too. "Now!" he shouted, and Catherine's security men revealed their true numbers, emerging from hidden positions around the station. At the same time, Chapman's trusted deputies moved to contain the outbreak in the prisoner car. The morning exploded into chaos, but it was controlled chaos, violence choreographed by Sullivan's careful planning. Carlton's men found their carefully prepared ambush turned against them, caught between disciplined security forces and their own growing doubts about their cause. "Your father sent you to do his dirty work," Sullivan called to Carlton Jr., who had taken cover behind a stack of crates. "Just like always. But this time it's different, isn't it? This time there's no hiding behind legal papers and bought judges." More of Carlton's men were throwing down their weapons, realizing they'd been outmaneuvered. The rifles in the hills still cracked occasionally, but their fire was scattered, uncoordinated. Through the gun smoke, Sullivan caught glimpses of the battle's flow. Chapman's men securing Martinez and the other prisoners, Catherine's security forces methodically clearing the station building, the remaining loyal gunmen realizing their position was hopeless. "It's over, James," Sullivan said, his voice carrying that quiet authority that had made him legendary. "Your father's empire is finished. Those documents will reach Fort Lincoln, and the truth about his corruption will finally come out." Carlton Jr.'s response was a desperate shot that splintered the wood near Sullivan's head. But the Marshal had already moved, seeming to flow like smoke through the morning air. His next shot knocked the second gun from Carlton Jr.'s hand, leaving him weaponless and exposed. "You're just like all the others," Carlton Jr. spat, nursing his injured hand. "Self-righteous men hiding behind badges, pretending you're better than us. But you're not. You're just another gunman." Sullivan stepped into view, his Colt steady, but not aimed to kill. "You're wrong, son. I'm what your father should have been, a man who serves the law instead of twisting it. A man who protects the weak instead of exploiting them." The last shots faded into morning stillness. The snow around the station was churned and bloodied, but Sullivan's careful planning had prevented any deaths. Carlton's men were surrendering. In groups now, their will to fight evaporating like steam in the cold air. Catherine emerged from the train, making her way carefully to Sullivan's side. "The documents are secure," she reported, "and Mrs. Thornton asked me to tell you she never doubted for a moment how this would end." Sullivan allowed himself a small smile. Smart woman. He turned to where Chapman was approaching with Carlton, Jr. in handcuffs. "Get them all secured. We'll sort out the charges when we reach Fort Lincoln." But James Carlton, Jr. wasn't finished. With surprising speed, he broke free from Chapman's grip and pulled a hidden derringer from his boot. "You've destroyed everything," he screamed, aiming at Sullivan's heart. What happened next became part of the Ghost Eyes legend. Sullivan's draw was too fast to see, his shot too precise to believe. The derringer flew from Carlton Jr.'s hand, its barrel split by Sullivan's bullet. "No," Sullivan said quietly, as Chapman restrained Carlton Jr. again. "Your father destroyed everything himself the day he decided his power was more important than justice." As the sun rose fully over Miller's Creek, Sullivan surveyed the aftermath of the battle. No one had died, though several of Carlton's men would need to see doctors about their injuries. More importantly, Judge Morrison's evidence was safe, ready to complete its journey to Fort Lincoln, where it would finally expose the corruption that had plagued the territory. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, standing beside him as Chapman's men began loading the prisoners. "Now we finish what we started," Sullivan replied. "The documents reach Fort Lincoln. Carlton and his corrupt allies face justice. And maybe, just maybe, people start believing in the law again." Mrs. Thornton, who had emerged from the train to witness the aftermath, joined them. "And what about you, Marshal? Will Ghost Eyes Sullivan ride again? Or does the card player return to his peaceful life?" Sullivan touched his gun, then looked at the badge Chapman had returned to him during the night. "Maybe there's a way to be both," he said thoughtfully, "to remember that sometimes keeping the peace means being ready to defend it." As the train prepared to resume its journey, Sullivan took one last look at Miller's Creek Station. The snow was already beginning to cover the signs of battle, nature reclaiming the scene of man's conflicts. But something had changed here, not just in the territory's power structure, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed justice triumph over corruption. The legend of Ghost Eyes Sullivan had gained a new chapter, but perhaps its most important lesson was that true justice didn't come from the speed of a man's draw or the accuracy of his aim. It came from the courage to stand up for what was right, the wisdom to show mercy when possible, and the understanding that every man's choices rippled out to touch countless lives. As the train pulled away from Miller's Creek, carrying its precious cargo of truth toward Fort Lincoln, Sullivan returned to his seat in the first-class car. But he was no longer just a card player hiding from his past. He was something more. A guardian of justice who had found a way to blend the best of both his lives into something new, something needed. The war against corruption in the territory was far from over, but today had shown that it could be fought and won by those who believed in the power of justice and truth. And as long as men like Ghost Eyes Sullivan stood ready to defend those principles, hope remained for a future where law meant something more than the will of powerful men.